Hey everyone, this isn't a music video. It's not a gaming video. If you like that kind of content, you're special. You're awesome. I like you. But the last music video is going to be the one right before this that I published. The album is nearing completion. I'm like over halfway done, so keep an eye out for it in the near future on Spotify. Gaming stuff, I do want to do another Star Citizen video. I'm just waiting for the next patch because they just patched out all the bugs in the 400i, so I moved back aboard it. And that's my ship from now on. And I'd like to do a video with that or a let's play with that in a better ship. Anyway, this is actually related to my last video series where this historical lecture where I read this book, Aryan and Semite, a discussion before the Judeans and Jewish Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, that is a very rare book. I had to go check it out from the US Holocaust Museum, and like nobody else had checked it out. So much, it was so unknown that the museum curators themselves, when I checked it out, they were like, wow, we didn't know this discussion took place. This is a super interesting book. And then they gave me this book, The Myth of the Jewish Race by Raphael and Jennifer Patai, which I found super interesting. This one's pretty publicly available. You can get it on Amazon, and I've referenced it a bunch of times. It is a fantastic book. If you want to hear that full discussion, it's the last series. I made it into a little playlist. Each video is about 2 hours. It's like 1 hour and 50 minutes each. But I read that entire discussion. And I wanted to read this really in conjunction or supplementally to that discussion because it relates to it. And it's more modern and it's a great book. Now, one thing to mention on, when I mentioned earlier about the other videos and stuff, please do like, comment, and subscribe on my videos because I don't trend well. I jump around on my topics a whole bunch, from music to gaming to history to lectures or education. And so the algorithm doesn't know what to do with me, first off. Second off, when it comes to specifically this stuff, bioethical kind of content, right? It doesn't trend well at all on YouTube because there's just nothing to sell. Civil rights does not sell. If you look at other people's channels where they endorse racism and eugenics, like Masuman, right? He believes in the Jewish bottleneck theory that Ellsworth Huntington came up with and then discredited in that discussion from the last video, right? So that kind of content does really well because places like 23andMe and Ancestry.com can sell their swab kits, their DNA testing kits through those channels and get people to buy them. So it works out well for the money. Like it monetizes well. This kind of stuff doesn't. If you look at the American Psychologist Association or Psychological Association, they did a series on eugenics, I think a year or two back. And it was really good, but like there's only like 5 viewers on it. The American Association of Genetics or something, a genetics research, I forget what it is. They did a similar thing. It's got like 3 viewers on it, right? You go to the Holocaust Museum's page, same thing. It doesn't trend well. The algorithm doesn't boost it because YouTube's not going to make any money off of it. No advertiser's going to want to advertise their stuff on there, right? It's a controversial subject, and it doesn't do well. So if you like this specific content more than any of my other content, please like, subscribe on it, and comment, and then share it. You know, it's the only way this kind of video subject's gonna actually get any traction. And that's part of the reason why I keep doing these kind of videos, because in the study that I'm writing, which, oh my gosh, pray for Andrew, that man is a blessing. He is in the hospital, and I just checked the figures in the study to pull for this video here, and he's actually gone through them while he's in the hospital and working on it. You know, man got beat up and is still working on this. That's how dedicated he is, which is just, it's amazing that I met somebody like that, somebody that is that driven and stuff. It's great. But he's been going through the figures to kind of clean them up, make them a little bit easier to read and stuff, as well as punching through some of the language to kind of clarify it a little bit better. But what we noticed, right, in our studies, we took all this data that we could, right, from a lot of it we didn't have access to, or they just didn't record it back then, right? But we took all these studies in PubMed, and I also looked at Google I just didn't map it like I did PubMed because I was mainly concerned with the public side of this. But we looked at all these studies that were published through there that dealt with the Jewish people or had labels for Jews, right? So things like that were keywords under Jewish disease, Jewish genetic diseases, Jewish genetics, Jewish genetics, Jewish genetic disorders, but the Jewish mutations. But the one thing that also was in there was Jewish bioethics. And that would be things like this book. And what we saw was all the way going back to 5750, that's 1990, or 5776, that's 2016 by the Christian calendar. Throughout those years, we saw Jewish bioethics papers that were counseling clinicians and researchers on how to use proper terminology, what's the best methodology for these kind of genetic studies to avoid labeling things as Jewish that, weren't and stuff that would induce hate. That was specifically what these kind of papers do, and it was working. There was a gradual change or decline in anti-Semitism overall. We went from over 3,000 reported incidents annually to almost 2,500, right? So we were at that's almost 1,000 reduced over that period of time, right? And then immediately after they stopped being published in 2016, we see a spike in studies that use terms like Jewish genetics or Jewish genetic diseases. And correlating to that spike, it's year-to-year correlations. We see anti-Semitism or acts of anti-Semitism start to spike up, right? And then when I went through the reports of anti-Semitism, not only do we see that around that same time, actual neo-Nazi groups are using these medical studies to cement their propaganda, like Harry Alster's book, Legacy, A Genetic History of the Jewish People, which I'll talk about later on in this video, gets passed around by them and cited by like actual neo-Nazi organizations and stuff as like hardcore part of their rhetoric. That starts happening too. And these bioethical studies, they stop getting published the same time that the Presidential Commission on like genetic issues, they have a different name for it every president, right? Every term. That got disbanded. It was part of the swamp, so it got drained, and nobody's put it back into fashion yet. Like Biden didn't reintroduce it after Trump. Trump hasn't reintroduced it now after Biden. So as soon as we stopped these bioethical kind of things, we see hate crime and the country itself here in the U.S. start to really polarize behind racism, right? And we start to see more tokenization and all that fun stuff. So I want to put this content out, and I want it to trend better because it actually does have an effect of reducing hate. Not a huge effect. It's very, very minor. And this is something that would take decades of constantly forcing it, like constantly reminding people, hey, you can't say that. That's actually super racist. This is why, and hey, that's not scientifically true. Hey, this is why. That's really just literally KKK propaganda. That does have a significant effect or an effect on reducing hate crime. So anyway, this book, again, it's a response or supplemental to the last lecture I gave, which was a reading of that Aryan and Semite, a discussion before the Judeans and Jewish Academy of Sciences. Now, again, that book or discussion is so rarely published that I had to go to a rare books room to read it. And I know people that have talked about it, right? Like Harry Alster, or even the Patais here, Raphael and Jennifer Patai, they weren't even aware that this conversation took place where Maurice Fishberg discredited their experiments that they're going to be talking about. Now, this book actually discredited Maurice's experiments in the same manner that Maurice Fishberg did himself. So they just reiterated all the same exact points that Maurice Fishberg made when he was like, hey, I was wrong before the Jewish people. Whereas Harry Alster, who also never read that book, and I know that because it's such a rare book that you can see who's actually read it. You can see who checked it out, and I know he didn't. In his book, Legacy, A Genetic History of the Jewish People, he endorses Maurice Fishberg's experiments at Ellis Island, saying, hey, we have better science these days, but he was on the right path. And here's why, blah, 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 blah. But he misses all the points that Maurice Fishberg made where he discredited his own junk. Where Maurice Fishberg was like, actually, I was wrong. And admittedly, I was cherry picking my test subjects because I wanted to fight Nazi propaganda by producing my own propaganda, right? And I read that. You can watch that entire video, right? So I felt like this would be really good because in that discussion, Maurice Fishberg brings up this whole idea of there being 3 separate races and stuff, Alpine, Mediterranean, and Nordic, and that just isn't the case, right? And Raphael Patai and Jennifer Patai discuss that in this book. And I mentioned this, I think I may have already said this, but I've mentioned this book several times. It's a fantastic book. It's publicly available. You can get it on Amazon. It's only like 30 years old. The Myth of the Jewish Race by Raphael Patai and his daughter Jennifer Patai. I believe they were both Israeli. I know they were both Jewish. But they specifically looked at how these eugenic stereotypes were junk and how they were affecting Jewish people. So it's great. It gives reference to that specific thing, so I knew I wanted to read it. But then, and I was going to wait like another week to do this video just because, again, I know it hurts my algorithm on YouTube. But I took some sailing lessons this weekend. So I'm now certified as a sailor. I can sail. And I do want to go keep doing it and get my captainship. So I'm going to get the practice lessons and all that when I get paid on Friday. So I can keep going and then do my 103 for my coastal. Man, it was really fun. I should have done this a long time ago. But, and it's sad because I've been called to the sea. This is the 3rd time I've been called to the sea. And I finally, 3rd time's the charm, I guess. I should have done it when I was 26. But there was this woman that was taking the lessons with me, and we have similar history, background, career-wise. She used to run a genetics lab. I think she's retired now. She may still run it. But we knew the same people, and when she found out that I used to work for the manufacturers, plural, of these genetic analyzers as a technician with the engineers and stuff, she complained about some of the instruments and stuff, and we started talking. And I almost immediately started to shut down that conversation. I didn't really want to talk to her about it because what she was saying was she was a eugenicist. It was super duper racist, and I don't think she even was aware of it. So we're sitting on this tiny boat, and like, if you know me, like know me, then you know how I am. If I'm trying to work on something, I'll work with people that I really just hate and I don't agree with. But we're not there for that kind of discussion. We were there on the weekends water to, learn how to sail. So that's what I wanted to focus on. And I kind of just ignored her comments and stuff and pushed away from that discussion. Now, if you get in my face like Sarah Goodman did and the people at Jenny Craig, that's a whole nother story. And that took 3 years to boil over. Like, in that situation, it was totally different. It was, first off, I didn't bring up my Jewishness at work other than when I requested a holiday off. And then I told Loretta that I would work for her on Christmas because, hey, I'm Jewish. I don't celebrate this holiday. That was the max of it, right? That was the most I volunteered. And I do that for anybody. If you want Christmas off and I'm working with you, please give it to me. Same thing with New Year's, right? These aren't my holidays. I don't celebrate Christmas, Halloween, or New Year's or any of that. That's just not my thing. That's not my bag. I'd rather take Rosh Hashanah off. So anyway, outside that, coworkers then started, because I was Jewish, they started asking me questions. And at first it was cool, nothing offensive. And then they hired Sarah Goodman, and she was totally offensive. In fact, she got one of her friends hired, this Trevor Grout guy, who was the only person to ever apologize. And to this day, I'm not sure if the apology was earnest. I like to believe it was, but I also don't think it was. His reason for apologizing was he was dating somebody who was trans, and so he was able to put himself in my shoes and go, oh, people are picking on this dude. And then he apologized saying, hey, Hayden, I'm really sorry. But I also don't know, because I'd already reported it, if it was just because I reported it. So maybe he was just trying to cover his own butt, or maybe he was honest. I prefer to think he was honest. But nonetheless, He was a friend of Sarah's. And when he first got there, he was making these kind of like anti-Semitic remarks and stuff. He actually brought a Uden star to work. It was a little acrylic black star with dollar bill signs on it, and he showed it to me and said, it's the sign of your people, and threw it back at him. So technically he didn't give it to me, he just showed it to me. And in the trial record, he did say, he admitted to it. He was like, yeah, I showed it to him and I destroyed it, being completely ashamed of what I'd done. That was her friend that she got hired, right? And then she's coming over to my desk from her breaks to say, hey, I just got off the phone with the German embassy. I'm going to collect my grandparents' pension from them. Well, first off, Adolf Hitler's platform ran on the pension, right? That was what he created for German government workers. Second off, a pension is you're only entitled to a pension if you work for a government. It's a state-backed retirement program. It's not a 401k. It's not a Roth IRA or anything like that. It's specifically the type of retirement program that you get if you work for the government. I work for the state of New York. I've only got a little bit longer until I vest in my pension as a state employee, right? Or a city employee. So the only way her grandparents would have a pension is if they worked for the party. She said other stuff. She came around my desk with actual memorabilia from the Nazi party and flaunted it. So when she did this, she leaned over my cubicle and showed it to somebody behind me. But she's in my personal space. Between me and my computer screen is this girl leaned over telling somebody, hey, look at this piece of Nazi memorabilia. And just so you know, it was a diamond wedding ring. Now, you would think that's not super offensive, but if you know your history, that is. The Nazis had a complete monopoly on the diamond trade. And she was telling this girl, this is Loretta behind me. She was saying, hey, this is my grandmother's wedding ring from back during the Holocaust. Well, if you had a period piece of diamond work like that, that means that they purchased that ring from somebody who was an ally of the Nazis because they had a complete monopoly. It's dossier 17 of the Nuremberg trials that were focused on economics, right? The Allies actually received reparations, war reparations, for disruption to the diamond trade. And if you look at all the rings that were from Jewish people at the Holocaust museums, they're all just plain golden rings because that is the custom of a Jewish wedding band. You're not even supposed to engrave them because they're supposed to be unbroken like what your marriage is supposed to be. It's a very significant thing. There's a whole midrash and all that on it. But yeah, so to me, as soon as you shove that in my face, I after 3 years of being picked on, being told that, oh, I'm not genetically pure enough to be considered Jewish like you, Sarah, who is 100% or something. Oh, the Jews are genetically diseased. It's not personal. It's just science. After that for 3 years, finally I did. I said something. And I had already gone to HR and everything. So I finally I stood up and told her, hey, look, Sarah, get out of my face. That's not a Jewish ring. You need to go to the Holocaust Museum. You're saying some really offensive stuff. And then I took a break and went outside, cried to myself, and walked around all angry for a minute because it was just like this lady whose grandparents literally had my family killed. If you want, there's a Holocaust letter reading on my YouTube channel from my actual family members. That's the last words we ever got from them. I'm never going to connect with them because her grandparents murdered them in Germany. And she shoved that proof in my face and then got away with it. So, anyway, what I was trying to say is if you know me, I don't really like to bring up these topics. I'll talk about them if you ask me questions. Otherwise, I keep it to an environment like this that isn't a workplace environment. Or I keep it, online to my Facebook or my YouTube. Well, I don't have Facebook anymore because they hacked my Facebook and got my address and then sent somebody there to try and attack me. So anyway, I keep this to like my YouTube and my online presence, to my personal life, to my personal space. That's where I talk about this kind of stuff. I don't like to bring it up on like work because it just causes issues. And so when I'm on this boat with this lady and she's trying to bring up all this stuff, I'm just really doing my best to avoid the conversation, and be that. I think that's good seamanship too, because if you're on a boat, you're with somebody in confined spaces, you're going to have to get along with people that you really don't like, because you can't get, like, there's nowhere to get rid of them. Like, you just shove them off in the middle of the water, right? So you got to put up with that kind of stuff. And the second day was even worse, because she looked at my face, and then she was like, "Hey, I think you've got some Nordic ancestry in you." And I was like, "Oh, brother." She was bringing up the same thing that Maurice Fishberg brought up with the three races: the Alpine, the Nordic, and the Mediterranean archetypes of European races and stuff. And it was just like, no. I mean, I wish. That'd be awesome. I would love to live in Norway or Sweden. I mean, Norwegians are rich. I'd rather go to Norway or to Sweden, just because the climate's a little bit better. But I mean, Norwegian women are hot and their language is beautiful. So, but nonetheless, and having lived up there too, I know how opposed to that kind of stuff, Scandinavians are as well. They don't like eugenics either, because they have even before Germany and all that, they have their own history with this kind of stuff and having to defeat it in their countries. And it's part of their drama when it comes to racism, because they've got issues with it too. So she says this to me on a boat, and I held it in, didn't roll my eyes, and stepped away from that. And then she also mentioned something else that was more personal, was she talked about how one of her studies was looking at how autism was inherited through ancestry. And my ears perked up on that, because my cousin has autism, but he didn't get it through ancestry. He got it from an environmental condition. So the booster shots that they were giving him in California had been packaged with mercury, which is a heavy metal. So they packaged this in mercury. It was a cost-saving initiative, but it seeped into the boosters. And this is also where, like, Rob Schneider, why he was blaming booster shots, except he wasn't blaming the packaging material of the booster shots. He was blaming the boosters themselves, which is kind of crazy. The packaging material that they were using, however, was mercury, and that's what was poisoning the booster shots, which ended up giving everybody autism. Now, as the topic we'll talk about in this book, actually, that condition of autism is entirely environmental. The reason why you would have it is because you've got, like, metals that have fused with your genes, right? And then you pass that down. The next generation could lose that characteristic of autism, or they could gain it. And that next generation could also gain autism just from receiving a high dosage of metals themselves, without having any ancestral or heritage of that trait, that genetic trait, right? So it's completely environmental. You're going to pick it up from an environmental source, right? And then you're also going to lose it from an environmental source. It's naturally, if you remove yourself from the high metal content, the generation after the generation that inherits it will most likely lose it, right? So these genetic traits, the point I'm trying to make, not only would you get them from an environmental source, so they're not related to your ancestry, they're related to the environmental condition of your ancestry. So it's not going to be that autism is a predominantly Jewish genetic disease because my cousin has it and they happen to be from a Jewish family, right? It would be autism is primarily a disease caused from having high metal content in your blood, in your genetics, right? Being exposed to that, right? Has nothing to do with Mikey having autism. It may seem that way because Mikey and all these other Jewish parents, or my Aunt Rachel and all these other Jewish parents went to the same doctor. So a high percentages of his patients who are Jewish now got poisoned with autism, but it has nothing to actually do with Judaism. It has everything to do with a bad doctor in Los Angeles, right? And if you tested Jews in another part of the country, even another part of Los Angeles, you're going to get a completely different genetic scoring, like makeup and all that, right? So not only is it environmental, but as we'll discuss here in just a moment, it also changes over time. So yeah, let's just go into it. So this is going to be a reading of The Myth of Jewish Race. It's a revised edition by Raphael Patai and his daughter Jennifer Patai. It was published in 1989. So hey, I was going to actually read this, but it's only excerpts. And so I figure what I'm actually going to do is I'll leave this up here and you can read this excerpt if you want, but I'll just kind of like go through some of the key highlights here because I don't want this to be a 2-hour video either. So on this one, it's part of the introduction of this book, and they have this whole thing where they're talking about race as a culture, race as a genetic concept, and so on and so forth. And again, what the Patais are looking at is debunking race altogether. It's a social concept. So it would fit more so, I guess, with the cultural aspect, or I guess race and culture. So what they're going to say is that there is no race. It's actually more of an idea of cultures, right? And then in this section here, race is a genetic concept. They even go down into that to say, hey, there's not really any genes that could tell somebody is one race from others. And they explain, hey, back to age antiquity, we've tried to use genetic differences or traits to describe different races and to label people and categorize them. We'd use things like, color of skin, hair, texture of hair, and shape of nose. These are like traditional means of separating people into races. And that there's more commonly people would think of there being only 3 types of races. There's white, yellow, and black, right? Or more recently, we may even say that there's dozens, right? With more recent eugenic thought patterns, it's not just, there's Jews and then Gentiles. There's Ashkenazi Jews, there's Sephardic Jews, there's Mizrahi Jews, there's 3 different types of Europeans, Alpine, Mediterranean, so on and so forth. But even that is limiting, and it removes somebody of their individuality. It causes misdiagnosis because then you're assuming things about a patient, even though that might not be their history or whatever, and so on and so forth. So it's lumping people into a various grouping of stereotypes, right? Which does a huge disservice. Now, they also go into how some genes, right, like darker skin tones and stuff, are common in certain people, which that's often termed as a race. However, the issue with that, like let's say skin color, what they bring up in here, certain darker pigments, right? Well, where do you draw the line on that then, right? Because yeah, certain genes would pass that down, but you first off, depending on where you're at, your children could, after several generations, lose that skin pigmentation. There's historical accounts of that. Also, who you marry and stuff like that could also change their skin. Then there's also diseases that change your skin color. But more importantly is, where do you set the line of between black and brown, brown and white, tan and white? Where is that definite line in skin color, right? When is somebody actually black and not brown, right? If you look at Brazilians, this is a great example, right, for that kind of thing. A lot of Brazilians are brown skinned. Not all of them. There are white people and there are Asian people and all. There's everybody down in Brazil. It's a modern country with a great diversity, but there are people that have brown skin, and then there are people that have really dark black skin, but they're not considered black. They're considered Hispanic or Latino or brown skin, right? Why? Well, their skin's just as dark as someone from Africa. So like where are you going to draw the line when you're dividing people up into races based on skin colors? And that's what the Patais are saying here, is that, you'd have to set a definite line. And then if you do that, you're going to run into issues like the Druze. The Druze are like, if you've met an actual person who's like Druze and they're from the Middle East and stuff, and again, with their culture, they could have people that have white skin and stuff too. But I'm just thinking of one specific instance of this one Druze guy I know. That dude was black. Like, he looked like he came from, middle of what most people would consider the middle of Africa and stuff, but he'd never even been to Africa, But if you took him out of the Middle East and, took the tan out of him basically for long enough, his skin would probably still remain pretty dark. I'm not sure, but the point I'm making is that not everybody from Africa is black. Not everyone that's black is from Africa. So you can't really say that being black is a race if people that aren't of the same genetic heritage as you also have black skin, right? Not even from the same geographic location as you, right? Solomon Islanders, right? They're dark as can be, but they're not from Africa, right? This is part of the reason when I was in Sweden, I actually started talking to by this one dude. We were friends, but we had a serious discussion about this. Because he was saying, I used to use the term African American. And he was like, dude, I left America because of that. I've never been to Africa. My ancestry isn't even from Africa. Yeah, I mean, I'm black, but I'm from Oceania, man. That's where like 3 generations back came from. I'm black. I'm not African at all. And I was like, huh. And so then I started using that terminology instead, just because, yeah, he's right. There are people that are black who aren't from Africa, like millions, And then even within Africa, there's a lot of white people and brown people and other skin colors. Africa is probably the most, behind Asia, I would say, is the most genetically or just the most diverse continent on the face of the earth. Maybe Asia might beat it out, and that's only because I think Asia is actually technically bigger than Africa. I'm not sure. Africa's never displayed right on maps, so it may actually be bigger than Asia. But there are a lot of people in Asia, and there are a lot of different people in Africa. There was this one lady I went on a date with. I forget her name. She is a school teacher out here, but we talked about something similar. I was like, "What do you wish they taught people in schools? Like, what do you wish you could teach your students?" She said, "I wish I could teach my students that not all Africans are the same. I come from West Africa, one of the West African countries. We are so different from the East African countries. There are people I really just don't like in East Africa and stuff, and so on and so forth." And she's right. When I was living in the refugee camp, and the very first bungalow I was in was with the Africans, and they were talking about, like, even within their own, like, country, little tribal differences and stuff, and like different ways of courting and all this other fun stuff. It's very, very interesting and eye-opening because there are just so many. It's such a diverse country, but then when it comes to the field of eugenics, I'm going to say, or genetics, and they're trying to determine gene frequencies and stuff, they all kind of get lumped together. It's all African American or all black, right? It's not, oh, Somalians. And even if you were to go into like just the one country to say, oh, people in Congo or something, you can't really do that because, like with Jewish people, a lot of the African peoples highly nomadic due to their environment. There is no way you are going to survive year after year outside like modern interventions, right? In Sudan, it dries out. There's droughts very seriously, so they need to move and stuff. That caused a huge conflict between like the Tutsis and the Huntsis, or I can't remember the two tribes that were fighting. But yeah, that's a huge, huge issue. They also talk about in this little section, because this is an introduction, so they give like a more thorough bit of it, but they talk about gene frequency and genetic drift. So they show with like, gene frequency that the Jewish people are the same as, any environment that they're in because they share the same gene frequency as the non-Jews that are around them and stuff. But they also talk about genetic drift and how like certain mutations, people might pick up a mutation or lose a mutation. And then some of these could be also related to a function of culture, like keeping kosher. What does keeping a kosher diet do to you in the long term, right? And like I mentioned in the last reading, right, one thing to consider was the fact that they look at endogamy, right, as a uh, instance of how like Jews became genetically distinct. And they actually mention that here with reproductive isolation. I think that um, not the Patais, but Raphael Folk, who did, I might read his paper too. He makes a better point of this when saying that you can't use something that would be a violation, a sin, to identify somebody as Jewish, right? That would be like saying pepperoni pizza is kosher because you saw a Jewish person eat it once. I'm not going to say that Jewish people have never eaten pepperoni pizza or had a ham steak. It happens. Everybody sins. I've sinned, right? I'll admit freely, I do need to go to Yom Kippur this year because you know what? I took a sailing lesson on Saturday. It was the only availability for me to go learn how to sail, and I want to do it, right? So for the next, I've got 103 and 104 that I'm going to have to do at some point. I'm probably going to have to go violate Shabbat to go do that. But it's not something I habitually do. It's not something I regularly do. I love going to Shabbat. The only reason why I miss it is when I have to for whatever reason. Now, in the U.S., I don't really have a legal right to Shabbat because of how the laws are written. So they can work me, on Saturdays or on Friday nights and Saturdays, and I don't have a leg to stand on or anything, right? Um, so yeah, sometimes I sin. Everybody does. You're not Moses. I'm not Moses. We're not the Mashiach. We've got our sins. But if you were to make that sin, me taking a sailing lesson on Saturday or eating pepperoni pizza, if you were to make that sin the definition of Judaism, how you identify as somebody as being Jewish, we're going to have major issues, right? And that's what they've done by looking at the endogamy aspect, by saying, hey, due to reproductive isolation or Ellsworth Huntington's bottleneck theory, right? If we use that sin of incest as a means to identify as somebody as being Jewish, you're not actually identifying them as being Jewish. You're identifying them as having violated Judaism. So you'd be proving the exact opposite. That's kind of why Jews are very hesitant about doing this counting kind of stuff or this official kind of stuff, like officially defining Jews or something like that, until the Mashiach, because hopefully they will understand these little transgressions, forgive us, allow us to atone on like Yom Kippur and stuff, and make those atonements, because our religion should be what we're using to define Judaism, right? You should be able to see somebody keeping kosher, put the kosher certification up as long as it's a good one, and that would be the definition of somebody that's Jewish, right? Somebody that would avoid taking a sailing lesson on Shabbat. That would be that would be something I would define as a Jewish activity, or something that would earmark somebody as Jewish. Again, we all sin. That's why Yom Kippur is such an important holiday, and you should go to it to atone for these little sins. But as long as it's something that you believe in and you're trying to practice and do, then that would be more so what I would consider the definition or the earmarking of somebody that's Jewish, rather than picking out some sin that their ancestors had done habitually, generation after generation after generation, right? So they weren't following Jewish marriages. They were following really what was a Catholic practice of marriage, or a Christian practice of marriage, by, at that time, marrying their cousins. That was something that the church ordained. The Protestants also did and stuff. And these are historical elements of Christianity. It's different religion these days, I feel like, in a lot of ways. There are proponents or people that would support that kind of ideology, but it's far and wide not what it once was. So they discussed that here. And again, I think for reproductive isolation, the Ellsworth Huntington conversation's a little bit better, because he debunks his own theory, and he was the one that came up with that. And then Raphael Folk's paper, There Is No Jewish Gene, which I'll do another reading of that at some point too, is fantastic for that. In this section of the book, I wanted to bring this up, and I think this is going to take a couple different slides. Yeah. So this is going to be a couple different slides, but this is the 4 views on Jewish race, right? And they try to break it down into these 4 concepts, that there's either Jews constitute a single race, which is that Jews would be genetically distinct, and that's like the earliest concept of it, and then 2 separate races amongst Jews, or racial types, right? And then we also have comprised of 3 races, or 3 racial types, which is the current belief, right? That's the more popular one of current times, that there's Sephardic, are genetically distinctive from Ashkenazi, who are genetically distinctive from the Mizrahi and stuff. And then the final one is the one I adhere to, and that this book adheres to, and what people that actually know their stuff adhere to, that Jews do not constitute a separate racial group at all, because we're the same as, like everyone else. There is no thing such as race. So they go down into this. They start with the single race concept. Now, under the single race, that's probably the oldest one, and that's to say that there's Jews and then there's Gentiles, and that's kind of that is really the basis of where Nazism starts to happen, right? And that goes all the way back to the beginning of genetics too. So they discuss that. Now, after that, we have this period where they're discussing 2 races of Jews, that they would comprise between Jewish and then non-Jewish, but then also Jews of Palestinian heritage, or Arab Jews, and then non-Levante Jews, right? So, and there are people that are Arab that have converted to Judaism. So they were looking at Jews by skin color. That would be a little bit later on, when we're talking about the discussion, the historical discussion of race, that it became 2 different distinct racial groups: white Jews and non-white Jews, essentially. Now, the next one's going to be the 3 racial types, right? And of this one, they discuss, what Maurice Fishberg was talking about. So what this would be dividing the Jewish races into the same way that Maurice Fishberg did with the Europeans, right? And you can even see it on the second page there, where it says, there are Babylonian, Sephardi, and Ashkenazi. That's Alfred Rupin talks about that, right? And so Southwest Asian Alpine Jews, or Occidental Philistine Palestinian Jews, right? Sephardi Jews, whereas the Ashkenazis are the Southwest Asians, right? And then you have the Oriental, which are the Bedouin or Babylonian type Jews and stuff, and that we see actually come about again when Maurice Fishberg's around, right? Because they were defining Europeans as 3 separate races, Jews as 3 separate races, so on and so forth. And so they discuss that and break it kind of down. And the issue with that is what they're going to go into, I guess, with the rest of this book, and it not being a separate race, that Jews are the same race, is because Sephardic and Ashkenazi don't refer to anything more than cultural practices coming from a geographic region, right? You had Sephardic Jews living in the Ashkenaz at the same time as Ashkenazi Jews. They still do. I've been to synagogues with Sephardic Jews at an Ashkenazi synagogue, right? I have Sephardic family members because they were in Morocco predominantly before they moved to Jewish homeland, before it was Israel, and then now I guess they're Israeli citizens. But they were from Morocco, right? So they were practicing Sephardi, whereas the other side, or the American side that I came from, mostly Ashkenazi practicing, right? I think on my grandfather's side, there's a Bevlim. No, either I think they're actually Mizrahi, right? We're all still the same family. It's just the way that we approach the traditions of practicing our holidays and stuff differentiate, right? So, for example, the Bevlim, or the Babylonian Jews, they read from a Torah that's in a box that you stand up, and then you can roll the Torah within this box casing. So the actual Torah scroll doesn't, it's harder to damage, right? Like it doesn't actually come out and stuff. So they have some really old Torahs because of that. that little boxing actually helps them survive a little bit longer. Groski Jews, right? I like bringing them up because like nobody even knows who they are. They come from the Pale Settlement, right? They're not Ashkenazi Jews. They look exactly the same as what most people would assume Ashkenazi Jews do. But they have a little bit of different traditions because they originated from the Caucasus Mountains, where the Pale Settlement and stuff was, and that's where the Ashkenazi Jews ended up migrating to, or where a significant number, and that gives way to the bottleneck hypothesis. But there were also Sephardic Jews that migrated into the Pale Settlement too, and Mizrahi Jews. There's evidence of that. But the point I'm trying to make is the Groski Jews differ from the Ashkenazis because they read from the Torah using two yods, which are pointer sticks, and then they put the word that they're reading between the two yods rather than pointing directly at the word. There's a reason for that. I forget what it is, but you wanted to like just highlight around the word to help with reading instead of pointing it. But that's how they read Torah. So you're in a Groski synagogue whenever you see two yods come out for the Torah, right? Different traditions it's all the same religion, right? We still believe fundamentally believe the same stuff. We just have different traditions of practice that come from those regions, right? It's not genetic at all. You could be an Ashkenazi Jew because you practice Ashkenazi Judaism, and your entire family could have come at all times from the Levant. But back when, I don't know, the Rothschilds, when they went out to Safed, right, in Israel, they sponsored creating a music school and helped preserve a legacy or a tradition of teaching Hebrew. Ashkenazi Jews, right? So they went to Israel. Maybe one of their kids remained there or whatnot. And now 2,000 years later or whatever, I think it's actually closer to 1,600 years later, they might appear to be Mizrahi because they have a darker skin tone or something like that. But the truth is that they still practice, Ashkenazic traditions when it comes to the practice of Judaism. So that would be sort of why there's not like a separation of these three different races when you look at Sephardi and all that fun stuff. There'd be even more if you were going to look at it that way, because you'd have to go through every single shtetl and small regional community to pull out what their genetic data is and stuff. But if we look at it from a cultural standpoint, which they brought this up in the beginning, race and culture and stuff, in the intro, if we look at it from the cultural standpoint, then it makes a little bit more sense, right? Because then those terms refer to a cultural practice of religion rather than a genetic standard of what those people would be, right? Yeah. All right, and so in this last one, I wanted to put this in there just because it relates to my study. And this was probably the most interesting, like the best. Oh, I love this. I love this book. It's such a great book. Jewish diseases. So what modern eugenicists have tried to do, right, is in order to explain how there would be a genetic commonality amongst Jews, they tested for diseases, rare, very, very rare diseases like Tay-Sachs and Gauchers and stuff. These are diseases that affect a very small percentage of a percentage of a percentage of a population. We're talking 0.000 whatever percent of a population. They're very rare. And so when they labeled them as Jewish diseases, there's another paper out there by, what's their name? Sherry Brandt and then Ruth, can't remember. But they did this paper on how Jews were being misdiagnosed because these concepts of Jewish diseases were so prevalent that actually like other genetic diseases weren't even getting screened for in them. People that weren't Jewish were just not being screened for this kind of stuff at all. And when I was in San Diego, it was a big topic because there were I think 74 families that sued UCSD over it because they identified as Christian, but they had Tay-Sachs. And so they had people in their family that had died of the disease and stuff, that, and so on and so forth, that had inherited these diseases, and just it just was not a good situation, and they didn't get tested at all for him or any treatment because they didn't identify as Jewish, right? Um, so that was a big discussion in San Diego, and what was amazing is that there were more families with Tay-Sachs that weren't Jewish when we added them into it than there were in San Diego. So then there were Jews in San Diego. So it was just like, wow, contradicting. So anyway, this section of the book goes through those diseases, and this is what I really like about this book, because they did a study for each one of these and found out that they were all hogwash. Like the one I like bringing up is this Tay-Sachs one, right? And so what they did for it is they tested infants from the US and Israel. And they found out that, yeah, in the US, it did appear that there were more Jews with Tay-Sachs than non-Jews. However, in the next generation, there were less. And they make that distinction in here. And then there were more people in Israel, period. Didn't matter what you volunteered as your religion, that had Tay-Sachs in there because of their human growth index, right? And so what they found out was Tay-Sachs doesn't at all correspond to whether or not your heritage is Jewish. It corresponds more to your human development index, because the people that were identified as carriers of it that were Jewish came over here from a country that had a lower human development index, right? And then when they had kids here in America, their children didn't have, they weren't carriers of Tay-Sachs because they were in a higher developmental index. And then what they found is the ones in a lower developmental index had a higher carrier rate, regardless of what they identified as, what their religion was. And then what we can extrapolate from that, even we could take it a step further, what I did in my study, to take it a step further to say, well, what if the genetic drift and degradation causes them to lose those genes as they age, right? So, or pick up a different genetic disease, right? So let's say you were born without Tay-Sachs, but you're in a really low human development index country forever and ever and ever, you may pick it up or something. So ideally, and they kind of touch on testing horizontally in this book, right? But the last book, Franz Boas and Max J. Kohler really make this point. Maurice Fishberg makes the point as well, but he does it while he's discrediting his earlier theories about race, to say, hey, I was doing narrow testing as well. So really, let's take Franz Boas and Max J. Kohler's point here. They said, hey, we weren't testing horizontally. We weren't testing a large enough swath of people. We were only testing very certain populations in very certain locations at very certain periods of time in history, right? If you repeat those tests on the same people at a different point in time, you may come back with a different genetic profile, because most of these things come from genetic disorders that are environmentally inherited, right? If we go back to my cousin and the autism, right? The way he got autism wasn't through my aunt. It was through a high content of mercury, of metal poisoning, seeping into his boosters, because the packaging was just substandard. And it was actually part of a government trial run by the US, or by the state of California, to see if they could save a couple of bucks on the packaging of boosters by using what they knew was a toxic chemical in the packaging for the boosters. Really, the doctor that she had was a terrible doctor. I think he got his license revoked. He may be still practicing. I'm not sure. It's really hard to take a doctor's license from them. I mean, there's a guy I watched that does like meme content and stuff, this wavy web surf, and he has this like Gooners video he did like 2 weeks ago that was really hilarious. But he talks about a doctor that would walk around his office naked, just seeing patients butt naked, dick flopping in the breeze, and he's like stretching in front of his nurse's staff. He pays them well, so they don't complain about him walking around naked all the time. But he got reported to the medical board, and then they were like, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't walk around naked." And he's like, "All right, whatever." And then he walked around naked some more, and he got reported again, and so on and so forth. And they finally took his medical license from him after like bunches of stuff happened. Right? It takes a lot to do something about a doctor, right? And Einstein University, perfect example. They've lost their academic accreditation so many times. So many times. They're on probation right now. And they may lose their academic accreditation again. Yeshiva University had to step in, pay a huge fine, and pull them out of the fire to get them on academic probation, just so that they could begin the process of reaccrediting Einstein University academically, right? Horrible college, horrible medical school. Um, Even today, I get their residents, and it's just like I get one of them on the phone, and it's just always just one of those conversations where you're like, how are you even capable of like living and feeding yourself? I'm sorry, but geez, you don't even know how to spell your own name. What's your date of birth? And they can't give it to you. It's just stupid. Hey, this unit isn't turning on. Well, did you try the power button? I've actually had to say that. And these are people that are like people that have passed college sometimes, that are teaching at these schools and stuff, and they don't even know how to turn the equipment on. And that's another thing, is a lot of this genetic stuff. Sitting in that environment, in that office, I realized one thing. Most of the people that do these kind of experiments end up having to call somebody at the company to validate their results, or they, not most, a lot, we'll say, I will say a lot, most will validate their results with like Thermo Fisher's tech support. They will have tech support run their experiments for them, literally. Um, you have to do the QA on the reagents that they're using, and a lot of labs will use other reagents in the equipment because it's cheaper, but then they don't calibrate against they don't provide accurate results because you're using Illumina's reagents in a Thermo Fisher in an ion spectrometer or something, right? So that's a huge deal. And so like, and to this day, I still get, it's weird. I'm an IT guy. I'm not a doctor or anything like that. I got into this rabbit hole as a historian primarily because I knew the history of this stuff, and I was like, wait, haven't we already had this discussion before in history about race? And isn't this all monarchy? And like, uh, isn't this Nazism or eugenics? Or Max J. Kohler proved, that all this rhetoric of that the Jews are a separate race, or Tay-Sachs carriers, or that your ancestry is Nordic, or some junk like that. That's actually verbatim propaganda from the Ku Klux Klan, and that's legally recognized. That's how they got the Civil Rights Act of 1965 to pass. Was they looked at propaganda from the KKK, which said that kind of stuff about black people, and then proved that it influenced hate crime. Same thing I'm doing for this study, but it's like nobody's ever proved that these genetic stereotypes about Jews influenced hate crime outside of like the Nuremberg trials, because they did do that during the trials for the Nuremberg trials to say, hey, these Nazi scientists actually did create the Nazi party and stuff. But we've never done that with America. So, and that's why my peer review board and stuff is being so super extra about this. They want it to be as airtight as possible, so that way we can't see the same discussion, same arguments being made. Or else we'll have another thing like this where I make this big long study like Patai and Patai did here, breaking down Tay-Sachs and Gouchers and stuff to prove that everybody is capable of having this, that there aren't more Jews that have it, that it's just as likely to be in Christians as Jews and stuff, and that we also got to look at past and next generations too, because it is a generational thing. It is environmental, and so on and so forth. So that kind of stuff has been said before, right? We've had everything I'm saying has been said before. But then these racist eugenicists with their propaganda from the Nazi Party and the KKK will figure out how to weasel around it and get back into education. And then next thing you know, all these bioethical studies are no longer getting published. Hate crime is spiking up. And instead, we have a bunch of eugenicists telling us that, white Christians do not have genetic diseases, unlike Jews who are riddled with them. White Muslims don't have genetic diseases, unlike Arab Muslims, who are probably the most inbred race of people possible. I've actually read that in a genetic paper about Arabs where they literally made that point that if you're white and Muslim, you wouldn't have genetic diseases, but being Arab and Muslim, you would, just totally messed up. So, my peer review boards are just like, they're really giving me such a hard time. And sometimes I don't deal with it well. And that's kind of what this here today is too. I had a talk with a friend earlier this morning, or I guess last night for me, this morning for you guys, because I work overnight, but we're talking about it and it's hard. You talk to these people like the girl on the boat and stuff, and they work in labs, and you're just the guy that's there to fix the equipment for them. But you know that there's not a switch on the piece of equipment, on the ion spectrometer, whatever you want to use, right? There's not a switch on there that tells me whether or not somebody believes in God. You can't configure the instrument to verify somebody's religious beliefs. So I know that what they're saying is BS. It doesn't fly. You couldn't prove using a genetic analyzer that somebody's Jewish because there's no way to program into that instrument the belief of Judaism. Like, you can't verify that in that way. You can't do it scientifically, basically. So to me, it looks like pseudoscience. And that was, what the Nuremberg trial commission said too, when Hitler and the Nazi scientists all did that. That's why they executed more German doctors than any other group of Nazi collaborator, So, but going up against those people is very tough because they're very set in their ways, as am I. But then they can toss a degree in your face or something like that. At which point I have to toss the schematics for the instrument in their face and go like, all right, well then why are you calling me to verify your results? Why are you calling me to run your experiment for you? Why are you calling me to fix your issue on this? You don't even know how to turn on the instrument half the time. It's like that. From my point of view as a technician, I'm like, well, you seem kind of like you don't know what you're doing. I know that you went to school for this or whatever. Like, you went to school to regurgitate the propaganda of the KKK and the Nazi Party. Okay, fine. But you don't know the tech involved. You had to call me to come fix it and stuff. Like, man, I should not have to run your experiment for you. If you're in Lab Cerner, this isn't with the genetic stuff, but if you're in Lab Cerner, it's not my job to show you how to reprint a label. It's my job to fix the label printer, right? It's my job to troubleshoot the software. But you getting your patient information and all that fun stuff, I shouldn't have to show you how to do that. I shouldn't have to show you how to register patients in Epic. There's nothing technically wrong with Epic running the way it is. You should know how to register your own patients or pull your own specimens. That's your job as that side of the medical profession. My job is just to fix Epic if there's a software glitch. My job is to fix the virtual desktop if you can't connect to it to get into Epic. If there's something wrong there, that's where I'm supposed to come in. But so many times in IT, I'm just going to say in IT in general, because even outside medical stuff, you get calls or you get emails or tickets for stuff that's so outside of like what your purview as an IT person is. Like, we get everything. It's like, oh, hey, I'm supposed to get hired today. Well, dude, I'm not HR, but I still know that process because I get enough calls on it that it's like, all right, I'm not going to turn you back to the administrator on duty to say, hey, you need to go do your Epic training. Here's the Epic training. This is how you register your patient and stuff. It's really annoying because you have to know so much extra stuff when it comes to the healthcare environment, and it like so much of it doesn't even pertain to any of what you need to know to do what you're actually getting paid to, right? Again, when troubleshooting these genetic analyzers and stuff, dude, I should not need to know how to plug in your patients or run an assay or anything like that. That's not my job. My job is to make sure that the equipment is able to function. Your job is to run your own experiment, not have tech support run it for you and then have software support verify it. Or not software support, but the reagent support guys or whatever. The what Matt and them did next to me. I forget what their actual job titles were. But it's not my job to run your experiment for you because I know the technical settings and how the instrument's programmed, and then have you take your experiment to the next desk over and have them verify your results for you because you don't know how to read this stuff, right? Like, that's what we're seeing, and that's kind of also the fear of what's going on with AI now too, because with help desks, we already have enough medical professionals that are calling a support center, calling me to do their stuff for them, even though they're the ones with the degree making all the money. But then they have to call me to do their work for them. And then with AI, it's another level because now we're going to have those same bad doctors that are relying on other people to do their stuff for them, do their work for them, enslaving me to their cause. Now using AI because they were getting in trouble for calling tech support so much. It's just a hassle. But anyway, so yeah, I was thinking about this book, and it's good to ground myself by getting back to reading this kind of content because it puts me back in my actual shoes. It reaffirms the values that I have, that there is no actual race, that we're all just humans, that there's no difference genetically, no real genetic difference between myself and Nassim Black in Brooklyn, right? We're both Jewish by our religion. Doesn't matter what our genetics are. His kids are Jewish, just like my mother's children were Jewish too, right? And so on and so forth. Um, we're all the same, and that's a core fundamental. That's the central belief of Judaism in monotheism, that there is only one God who created only one race through Adam and Eve, right? So, getting back to that and reading this kind of stuff and doing this kind of a video on YouTube, it does help me and like kind of recomprise myself. Because when I come up against these people that run the labs, like the girl from sailing and stuff, um, it can blow me off course really easily. It's very persuasive and pervasive propaganda. And if you don't think on it critically, if you do what Ellsworth Huntington was saying, if you just look at statistics and you don't consider the surrounding facts, the other aspects that should be considered with those statistics, then you're going to start making a lot of really crazy assumptions, and then it becomes pseudoscience very, very quick, right? So, yeah. Anyway, have a good one. If the patch for Star Citizen releases this week, I might do another video upload this week. Otherwise, I have another song coming out Monday. The next song will be dealing with another Jewish topic. So if you've noticed on the album, I've been interspacing my love songs because I have a bunch of those for nobody, and then like Jewish topics. Really, the album's me wrestling with my own personal history and the Jewish community and certain aspects within that topics from that. So it's very personal in that aspect. But I also tossed in some of my other songs, like my love songs, just so I could have those out too, and to give the album a little bit of filler. But also, it kind of fits the narrative story of like in between going through these hardships as a Jew, like being attacked and having somebody murder somebody at a synagogue that I went to a lecture at, or having somebody shoot at my house, or having somebody want to get a pension from Germany, stuff like that. In between those moments, there have been like me dating and stuff like that and meeting people. So I guess like those love songs represent those moments interspace between these like really heavy moments and stuff. Um, so that's kind of nice to. I mean, it's kind of a break from the intensity of the album because it is a very intense one. Yeah, yeah. So please enjoy the album. Please watch these videos. Remember to like and subscribe. Leave a comment on a video if you like it. If you think, even if it's like even mildly something you would endorse or something, leave a like and leave a comment, just something to help it trend a little bit better. Because again, the YouTube algorithm's not going to do me any sort of favors here. And have a great week.